5.
The Russian foreign minister's warned that any attempts to arm the rebels in Syria will be regarded as a breach of international law. Sergei Lavrov was speaking following a meeting with his counterpart, William Hague, who says the crisis in Syria has reached catastrophic proportions. Let's talk to Nabila Ramdani, freelance journalist and Middle East analyst. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Anna.
This really seems that the two sides, particularly in the case of the UK and Russia, are coming at it from completely cross purposes, because we heard yesterday from David Cameron that, in fact, he would consider arming the rebels in Syria, and Russia is saying something completely different.
Well, yes, absolutely. And we've heard a little clip from William Hague earlier on your programme saying that the British government was pushing for political solutions still, but they are clearly exploring the not only the diplomatic route, as testified by the very meeting between William Hague and his Russian counterpart, but clearly the British government is increasingly and openly talking about military aid and providing the Syrian rebels with weapons, which would be going a step further than what they are providing for the moment, which is armed vehicles and body armour and non-lethal equipment. You're quite right, David Cameron went as far as saying that he would be prepared to bypass the EU arms embargo if other member states refuse to lift the measure in May. I think crucially, the background of the royal visit to Syrian refugee camps in Jordan as well is highly political, because British intelligence teams and indeed special forces have been in Jordan for over a year now, giving Syrian rebels military training and also logistical and security advice. So what British officials argue is that the training of Syrian forces is crucial to fill the security vacuum for as and when the Assad regime collapses. So the royal visit has to be put in the context of strengthening the cooperation between the two countries, as they are both adopting a tactical shift in the handling of the conflict in Syria, effectively.
And the difficulty that we've talked about many times before is that when it does come to arming Syrian rebels, which group of Syrian rebels do you choose? There are so many disparate groups. And then once you have armed them, how do you know that those arms then won't be passed on to be used against the UK, against Western countries?
Well, very much so. And I think the Russians are clearly a stumbling block here in finding any decent solution to the ongoing slaughter. But they do have a point as far as international law is concerned. Arming the rebels would clearly be a breach of international law. And maybe it has to be said that the Russians felt a bit cheated, if I may put it that way, over the conflict in Libya, when a UN intervention and indeed a NATO intervention, which was meant to protect civilian lives, turned into mission creep and indeed brought about regime change, which is again against international law. So that's what the Russians fear would happen in Syria, and they are fiercely opposed to it. But in the meantime, it's the people of Syria who are suffering massively, and the figures we're hearing from human rights organizations, the United Nations, are very, very grim indeed. We've reached, a milestone of 1 million people, 1 million refugees, more than 70,000 people being killed. The children are the ones who are suffering the most. But, arming the rebels would certainly trigger a debate within British society, I'm convinced, because we are currently reflecting on the legacy of the Iraq War, for example. And there's a very concerning extremist element to the Syrian opposition as well. Clearly, there are groups inspired by Al-Qaeda who are not just determined to get rid of Assad, but they are up to more evil deeds as well. So I think the British government will have to consider that as well.
Speaking about the humanitarian crisis, as you did there, the refugee camps, and the headlines that will inevitably be brought by Prince Charles's visit to a refugee camp in Jordan today, other than turning the spotlight on what's happening there, it doesn't really seem to offer any progress, any hope for change for those people who are living in those camps.
Well, absolutely. I think what this visit does and why it is so important is that it will highlight the issue of Syria's refugee crisis enormously. And it doesn't matter how many images or reports about these kinds of problems appear in the media. In the end, I'm afraid it's almost always an association with high-profile international figures like a royal couple, which raises them to the top of the news agenda. And clearly, resources are needed urgently. So the fact that the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall will not only got to meet some of the refugees, got to hear about their heartbreaking stories, it will inevitably bring to the fore the plight of the Syrian refugees. But it has to be said as well that many commentators will note the obvious irony, and the almost disturbing juxtaposition between the royal way of life and indeed the refugee camps. And do not forget either that after visiting the refugee camps, the couple will fly to Qatar, arguably the richest Gulf country, and then on to Saudi Arabia, which has an appalling human rights record.
Thank you, Nabila Ramdani, who is a Middle East